Imagine charting foreign policy when the map of the world is just, well, it's essentially half blank.
Right, like totally unknown territory.
Exactly. There are no satellite feeds, no global news networks. Your entire geopolitical strategy is built out of, whispered travelers' tales.
Rumor.
Rumors, yeah, and an absolute literal belief in physical
You're
miracles.
basically navigating global politics completely in the dark.
You really are. And then suddenly this wild card arrives from a direction you barely knew existed, and he offers you the ultimate diplomatic weapon.
Which brings us to the year 1122.
Yes, 1122. The setting is Rome, and the mission of our deep dive today is to explore how one bizarre diplomatic encounter with a guy called the Patriarch of the Indians.
Quote unquote, right.
Right, quote unquote. How this encounter accidentally birthed a 500-year geopolitical myth.
It's just wild. A myth so pervasive that it redirected the entire course of global exploration.
And, as we'll see, deliberately derailed actual military campaigns.
Yeah, so to trace that chain reaction, we're looking at a very specific stack of historical sources today.
What are we working with?
So we've got 12th century eyewitness letters, anonymous monastic manuscripts that basically function as viral propaganda.
Like the medieval internet.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And we're pairing those with modern historical syntheses of the actual people who got buried beneath this myth, specifically the Syro-Malabar Church.
Okay, so to understand how one single visitor triggers a centuries-long global wild goose chase, we kind of have to look at the power dynamics in Rome in 1122, right?
Oh, absolutely. The context is everything here.
Because Pope Calixtus II, born Guy of Burgundy, by the way, he's sitting on the papal throne.
Wow.
And he is perfectly primed to weaponize a good story.
He really is. Because he just pulled off this seismic political victory, the Concordat of Worms.
Right, and for those who might need a quick refresher, why was that such a huge deal?
Well, the Concordat of Worms basically resolved the investiture controversy.
Which was, what, the most bitter conflict of the Middle Ages?
Arguably, yeah. For decades, the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor had been fighting over who actually had the right to appoint or, invest local church officials.
Like bishops and abbots.
Exactly. And this wasn't just some abstract spiritual debate.
No, because bishops controlled land, right?
Well,
Wealth, armies.
huge tracts of land, military levies. So Calixtus negotiated this calculated masterstroke where he forced the emperor to concede the spiritual investiture back to the church.
Which fundamentally shifts the balance of power in Europe.
It does. It was a massive win for Rome.
It's remarkably similar to modern jurisdictional battles, like when a nation-state tries to regulate a multinational tech monopoly.
That's a great comparison, like who actually owns the infrastructure.
Exactly. Calixtus essentially won the monopoly back for Rome. He stabilized the Papal States, defeated a rival anti-pope, and now he's prepping to host the First Lateran Council in 1123.
He's taking a victory lap, basically.
He is. He wants to ratify his supremacy. He needs this sweeping gesture to show that Rome is the undisputed capital of the whole world.
And right at that exact moment, this guy named Marjan walks into the Lateran Palace.
The timing is just incredible.
The historical serendipity is striking, really. Marjan, or Johannes as he's called in the Latin sources, is the Metropolitan of India.
Okay.
And he was dispatched around 1120 by the Church of the East, which was based over in Mesopotamia.
Okay, wait, let's unpack this for a second.
Yeah.
Because there's a glaring theological paradox here.
You mean the Nestorian connection?
Yeah. The Church of the East was historically known to Rome as the Nestorian Church. And didn't the Roman Church condemn Nestorianism as a heresy, like centuries earlier?
Yeah, at the Council of Ephesus.
Right, because of how they define the divine and human natures of Christ. So why is a pope who is totally obsessed with orthodoxy rolling out the red carpet for a supposed heretic?
Cynical pragmatism.
Really? Just politics?
Pretty much. The political calculus simply outweighed the theology. Calixtus needed to project universal dominance, and Marjan was just the perfect prop.
Wow.
But, Marjan's arrival in Rome wasn't exactly a straight line.
No, he took a major detour.
He did. He originally traveled to Constantinople. He was seeking an audience with the Byzantine emperor because he wanted a pallium.
Which is like a specific wool vestment that symbolizes patriarchal authority.
Exactly. He probably needed it to solidify his own political standing back home in India against local rivals.
But he never actually gets it from the Byzantines?
Nope.
Because he runs into this delegation of Roman clergy in Constantinople, and they pull off what is basically a medieval diplomatic hijack.
They totally poached him.
Yeah.
The Roman legates saw the opportunity instantly because remember, the papacy and the Byzantine Empire are locked in this bitter competition for supremacy after the Great Schism.
Right. So the legates convinced Marjan that Rome, not Constantinople, is the true capital of the world.
Yeah, they tell him Rome is the only legitimate source for his pallium, and they redirect his entire mission to Italy.
It's literally the 12th century equivalent of corporate espionage.
How so?
Imagine a brilliant tech founder from an emerging market, right? He flies to Silicon Valley to pitch a major firm for funding.
Okay, I see where you're going.
And while he's sitting in the airport lounge, executives from a rival firm intercept him, buy him a drink, and convince him to come to their headquarters instead.
And it's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
But, the Latin sources frame this encounter very differently.
Oh, of course they do. They depict Marjan as this awestruck, submissive pilgrim who was just dazzled by Roman authority.
Which is so self-serving.
I have to push back on that narrative entirely. Wasn't Marjan playing them just as much as they were playing him?
Oh, absolutely. He was engaging in sovereign diplomacy.
Right. He's navigating between two rival superpowers to get the backing he needs.
He secured his pallium and elevated his own prestige. But because the Roman legates poached him, they needed his testimony back in Rome to be spectacular.
To justify the theft.
Exactly. They had to prove to the Pope and the Curia that stealing this guy was worth the diplomatic headache.
Well, the testimony Marjan delivers at the Lateran Palace absolutely delivers on that front. It's wild.
It is a highly calculated blend of geographic facts and sheer theological spectacle.
So he stands before the College of Cardinals, and he tells them he comes from a city called Ulna, or Holna.
Right.
And he says it sits on the river Fison. Now, that specific river name is not an accident, is it?
Not at all. The Fison is literally identified in the book of Genesis as one of the 4 rivers flowing out of the Garden of Eden.
Wow.
By claiming his city sat on the Fison, Marjan was establishing this massive ontological anchor.
So tying your local geography to biblical topography was just a recognized diplomatic strategy.
Yeah, it established unassailable legitimacy in the Middle Ages.
That is brilliant. So he says this river flowed with gems and gold, and his city was a Christian utopia with 0 heretics.
0 infidels. Just a perfect Christian society.
But modern historians point out that medieval geography was incredibly elastic, right?
Very. The concept of the 3 Indias could mean anything from Ethiopia to the Arabian Peninsula to the actual Indian subcontinent.
So do we know where Ulna actually was?
It's debated. Some think Ulna was actually Urha, which is the Syriac name for Edessa, a city that claimed to hold St. Thomas's relics.
Okay.
But others argue he was describing Mylapore, the actual site of St. Thomas's tomb near the Adyar or Kaveri rivers in modern-day Chennai.
It's a complex puzzle, but because the Curia accepted the biblical geography of the river Fison, they were totally primed to accept the miracles he described next.
Yeah, they swallowed it hook, line, and sinker.
And here's where it gets really interesting. He describes the St. Thomas shrine in vivid detail. He says the apostle's body is perfectly intact.
Perfectly preserved, just sitting on an episcopal throne.
Appearing asleep, with his face shining like a star. And he specifically mentions red hair and a crisp red beard.
Which is such a vivid, bizarre detail to include.
It really is. But then we get to the centerpiece of the testimony, the Eucharist miracle.
Right.
Marjan claims that during the annual Feast of St. Thomas, the dead saint's preserved hand actually physically animates.
A zombie saint.
Literally. The hand animates to distribute communion offerings to the faithful. And if you're worthy, the saint gives it to you.
But if you're unworthy...
The macabre relic violently withdraws and refuses the blessing. It acts as a physical judge of your sins.
Now, we have 2 primary lenses through which this crazy testimony was recorded.
Right, the sources.
The first is an anonymous manuscript called De Adventu Patriarchi Indorum. This is the viral one. It hypes up the marvels and just exploded in popularity across European monasteries.
But the second source is very different.
Yeah, the second is a letter from Odo of Reims. He was an abbot and an actual eyewitness in the room.
And Odo notes that the Roman officials were actually highly skeptical, right?
Extremely skeptical. They didn't take this animated relic stuff at face value at all. In fact, to prove his claim, they forced Marjan to swear a formal judicial oath on the Gospels.
Okay, the cognitive dissonance of that moment is just fascinating to me.
Also.
You have a room full of the most cynical, legally minded bureaucrats in all of Europe. They demand a legally binding oath under penalty of perjury.
Right.
Yet the second Marjan puts his hand on the Bible and swears to it, they officially validate the claim, that a deceased apostle with a red beard is physically handing out communion wafers.
It sounds absurd to us.
How does a court that cynical justify that leap in logic?
Well, what's fascinating here is the theological timing. You have to look at what the church was fighting against in 1122.
Anti-clerical heresies.
Exactly. Movements were sweeping across Europe that deeply questioned the authority of the priesthood. But more importantly, they were questioning the real presence of Christ in the sacrament of the Eucharist.
Ah, they were doubting the physical reality of the communion.
Yes. So the Pope needed a didactic tool to shut down these skeptics.
And suddenly, a story about an apostle physically animating to judge communicants falls right into their lap.
It was the perfect piece of propaganda to enforce new orthodoxies. Once that formal oath was sworn, the story stopped being an exotic rumor. It became officially sanctioned truth.
Because it perfectly validated the Pope's current political agenda.
Precisely.
But here's the problem. Once Rome legally validated this miracle, the story totally escaped their control.
Oh, it mutated almost immediately.
We transitioned from a sworn testimony by a real bishop in 1122 to the birth of a 500-year mystery.
Marjan goes back to the East, but his identity takes on a life of its own in the Western imagination.
The Bishop of India mutates into this magical superhero emperor known as Prester John.
And we can actually trace the timeline of this mutation. The first written mention of Prester John pops up in 1145 from the chronicler Otto of Freising.
And what does Otto say?
He describes this Nestorian Christian king in the East, a descendant of the biblical Magi, who rules over unimaginable wealth and just defeated the Persians.
So he transforms from a church diplomat into a rex es sacerdos, a priest king.
Yes, and the propaganda machine goes into absolute overdrive by 1165.
That's when the forged letter of Prester John starts circulating, right?
Exactly. And the mechanics of this forgery are crucial. It wasn't just some random fairy tale. It was a highly calculated political weapon.
Scholars think it was written by Western clerics tied to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, right?
Yeah. And they specifically addressed this fake letter to the Byzantine Emperor, Manuel I.
The letter is just a masterclass in psychological warfare. It takes the original details of Ulna and turns them into a cinematic fantasy.
Oh, it goes completely off the rails.
The author claims Prester John rules over 72 different kings. He commands armies of horned men. He controls griffins.
Griffins.
Right. But it links directly back to Marjamon's real visit by extensively referencing the shrine of St. Thomas.
And addressing it to the Byzantine emperor was a very deliberate insult.
To mock their military weakness.
Exactly. By fabricating this all-powerful Eastern Christian monarch who was allied with the Latin West, they were basically shaming the Byzantines for losing to Islamic forces.
And even without a printing press, this thing went viral. Monks are copying it by hand in scriptoriums, translating it into vernacular languages.
They treated it like the ultimate geopolitical thriller.
But this propaganda had devastating real-world consequences. I mean, let's look at the Fifth Crusade at Damietta between 1218 and 1221.
That is the perfect example of how dangerous this myth became.
The Crusaders are bogged down in Egypt. The Islamic forces want to end the conflict, so they offer incredibly generous peace terms.
They literally offered to return Jerusalem to Christian control.
Which was the whole point of the Crusades. But the papal legate, Pelagius, outright refuses the terms. Why?
Because the Crusaders were completely gripped by a sunk cost fallacy, totally fueled by the Prester John myth.
They were waiting for a rescue.
Rumors were sweeping the camps that a vast Christian army led by King David, who was supposedly Prester John's grandson, was marching from the east to annihilate the Islamic forces.
The body count caused by this delusion is just staggering.
It's tragic psychology at play. If you believe an invincible magical army is days away, why settle for a negotiated peace?
So they hold out, the Nile floods, the Crusader army is trapped, and the expedition ends in a catastrophic failure.
So they threw away Jerusalem for a phantom.
At what point did people realize they were waiting for a superhero who didn't exist? Because even in 1498, Vasco da Gama arrives in India still actively looking for Prester John.
That's where the concept of mythistry comes in. This wasn't just ignorance, it was a psychological survival mechanism.
Meaning what, exactly?
Medieval Europe was facing an expanding, highly sophisticated, and terrifying threat from the unknown Islamic world. They felt outmatched and surrounded.
So they desperately needed a rearguard ally to strike their enemies from behind.
Right, and because one didn't exist, they invented him.
Wow.
Marjan's 1122 visit provided that necessary grain of tangible truth. The Latin West took that real encounter and cultivated it into a myth-history to navigate their own deep geopolitical anxieties.
It gave them hope when strategic reality offered none at all.
Exactly.
But, by obsessing over this fictional savior, the West committed a massive act of historical erasure.
They really did.
We have to pivot to the victims of this myth. By fixating on Prester John, the West completely ignored the vibrant, real society Marjan actually represented.
The tragedy of that erasure is profound. Focus on the St. Thomas Christians, the Nazranis of the Malabar and Coromandel coasts.
They weren't mythical subjects of some priest king.
Not at all. They were an autocephalous, meaning locally autonomous, community with massive socioeconomic power.
The sources outline how they operated. They held royal grants, like the 825 copper plates of Vinod.
The Teresa Pali copper plates, yes.
What did those plates actually grant them?
They granted the Nazranis extensive tax exemptions, monopoly rights over specific trade guilds, and social privileges that basically equated them to upper-tier Hindu castes.
So they were dominating the mercantilism of the region.
Absolutely. They controlled the cultivation and export of pepper and spices. They maintained their own Syriac liturgical traditions while blending seamlessly into the cultural practices of their Hindu neighbors.
Which completely changes how we should view Marjan's 1122 visit.
It changes everything.
He wasn't some humble, dazzled pilgrim. This was vernacular Christianity stepping confidently onto the global stage.
He was a diplomat representing a wealthy, autonomous trading guild, playing the Byzantines and the Romans against each other as equals.
But the West refused to see them as equals. Instead of engaging with that reality, they engaged in Christian colonization.
They stripped the Nazranis of their agency. They overwrote the real history of the Indian community with Latin anxieties and fantasies about Prester John.
They didn't want a complex trading guild. They wanted a magical king to fight their wars.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for us today? Think about modern information consumption. The psychological mechanisms haven't changed since 1122.
No, they really haven't.
When you look at a new data set or a historical source, how often do you only extract the parts that confirm your own pre-existing worldview?
We all do it.
You ignore the actual, sometimes uncomfortable human reality behind the data because the myth is simply more comforting.
This raises such an important question about how historical events are always filtered through prevailing geopolitical frameworks.
The Roman legates filtered Marjan's arrival through their rivalry with the Byzantines.
Calixtus filtered it through his need to crush European heresies.
The Crusaders filtered the forged letters through the terror of their impending defeats. The actual truth of the Syro-Malabar Church was just buried alive under Western utility.
Sobering thought.
It really is. To recap this incredibly unsettling journey, we started with a real diplomatic visit in 1122 by an Indian bishop securing his political authority.
He tells a story of a golden city and a living corpse.
The papacy demands an oath, validates the miracles for PR, and accidentally spawns a fabricated king that derails the Crusades and drives the Age of Discovery.
It just shows the terrifying power of narrative. The red-bearded saint in the biblical geography were embellishments, but they physically redrew the map of the world.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to explore on your own.
Hmm.
The West invented Prester John because they desperately needed an ally to save them from a complex geopolitical threat. They were too terrified to face reality.
They needed a magic bullet.
Exactly. So what modern saviors are we currently mythologizing? Are you pinning all your hopes on a revolutionary piece of technology to magically resolve the climate crisis without any societal sacrifice?
Or a political disruptor who promises to fix everything overnight?
Right. What complex global crises are we refusing to face because we are waiting for a mythical rescue? The next time you find yourself clinging to a narrative that seems a little too miraculous, challenge yourself. Look at your sources.
Think back to the Lateran Palace in 1122.
And ask yourself, am I reading the truth or am I just looking for Prester John?